So before getting into the slides, I want to take some time, a little bit of a preamble to kind of give some history and context to this conversation. You heard a lot tonight in public comments, and I feel like I need to give a little bit of context. And I'm not going to go too deep into history, but at the August 10th meeting, this board approved the Continuity of Learning Plan. MSTE put out a planning document for school systems to use early in the summer, had 13 non-negotiables, as they called them, and Harford County produced a plan that addressed those 13 non-negotiables. On August 27th, at a press conference, the governor, the state superintendent, and the new interim health director provided information suggesting that schools need to be back in person, and suggested that there were many districts that did not have plans for return to in-person learning. And from our continuity of learning plan, of course, we did not have how we would return to in-person included in our plan, but that also was never an expectation. In fact, on September 1st, the State Board of Education voted to require school districts to update their plans with regard to in-person learning. So they explicitly asked school districts to do that. And we have a due date to provide information related to that by, I believe, the third week in November. So that is an expectation that I am confident we will meet long before the November deadline. And I also, when we finish this presentation, you'll see we have plans to return students prior to that as well. Also on August 27th, the date of the press conference, in the press release, a joint document that was produced by the State Board of Education, the State Department of Health, and the Governor's Office provided for the first time guidance with regard with some specifics about the metrics that we should be using for decision making. Personally, I recall asking, we've had frequent conversations among superintendents and with the state superintendent, and I certainly remember asking for specifics about, what type of data should we be looking at for making decisions back as early as April. That being said, we received nothing about the metrics we should use for decision making until August 27th, when that guidance document came out. You can find it online. It is a helpful document. It's the plans for Maryland schools to return, and there's a couple things that are reiterated in there, and I think that's also it's been helpful to have this to point to. Page 5 of this document basically explains that school systems need to follow the 6-foot physical distancing rule, and the way it's written is that school systems need to make all practicable efforts to ensure students remain 6 feet apart. And so while there is some flexibility within that, I think the spirit is we should be doing everything we can to keep students 6 feet apart. And then there's also guidance there that suggests that students should remain within certain cohorts and not be mixing. And that's been particularly problematic in our planning for any type of hybrid model for secondary students, because students in middle schools and high schools, they change classes multiple times during the day, and thus the groups mix. And that's been a hard thing to schedule for. In order to ensure that students are receiving in-person learning from their teachers, they need to mix across these groups. And so those are two really challenging pieces of guidance so at the same time we were getting very clear messaging about returning in person, we were also getting equally clear messaging about the restrictions we have in terms of the educational structures that we can support. Also, at the State Board of Ed meeting on September 1st, the board brought up another topic, and this was something presented by the state superintendent, about requiring all students, pre-K through 12, to have a minimum of 3, if students were engaging in virtual instruction, that they should have a minimum average of 3.5 hours of synchronous instruction per day averaged over across the week. The state board set a due date that we would have all of our grade levels in compliance with that by the end of this calendar year. And so, again, I believe we will be in compliance by that point. At this stage right now, the only grade level that's not in compliance with 3.5 hours of, at least in our planning, is pre-K, and this evening you did approve in the consent agenda the purchase of devices for our pre-K students also, because we did not have devices for them in the early plan. So there we'll be able to do more synchronous learning with them. Also, on September 1st, the governor, in addition to the state board meeting early in the day, the governor had a press conference at the end of the day on September 1st, at which point he moved or announced that the state would be moving into stage 3 as of Friday evening, September 4th that week, that we've been moving into stage 3. And one thing, if you've been watching closely, the press conferences and the interaction between the governor and the state superintendent, until August 27th, the governor had never spoken to education. He left all details related to education to the state superintendent. And so August 27th was the first time he spoke specifically about what should be happening with education, but none of his executive orders speak specifically to education. So we've had no guidance about what schools should be doing specifically in each stage. Currently, we have the guidance we received on the 27th, which I'll talk more about tonight. I'll go into the metrics that are included in there. You'll see those and see how we've designed our plans around the guidance that we currently have in place. But even since that September 1st announcement that the state is in stage 3, we have no additional guidance about what stage 3 might look like for school systems. So we need to understand that as of right now, there is no stage 3 for schools. We're under the guidance. That I'll get into those metrics a little bit later. So let's talk briefly about learning centers. We did make a change over the summer to move toward the practice of learning centers. And I think I've said this many times, what we're doing right now, everything is unprecedented. And we've focused a great deal on the logistics to keep staff and students safe while delivering an instructional program. The learning centers, and people, argue this, I won't try to make the point, the learning centers are not about face-to-face, they're not about live in-person learning, they're not about students receiving instruction directly from their teachers in the classroom. They are there so that our students have a place to be 5 days a week, because no hybrid model could offer that. Knowing that families, and some families more than others, need to be back at work, and also knowing that many families in this community do not have internet. And so without a place for our students to be, for those students in particular, to have an opportunity to be 5 days a week, we couldn't be sure that students would be able to engage in the online learning. And so that idea that some students need a place to be 5 days a week and internet were two of the big drivers for why we wanted to do the learning centers. And that wasn't an option. We couldn't do that alongside a hybrid model. We couldn't deliver on both because we do not have enough capacity for some students to be there 5 days like that, and to do the hybrid as we laid it out. Because at the time in the summer, we were talking about a hybrid that would have brought back 50% of our students at a given time. So right now, where we are, with the guidance that we have, when you think about the 6-foot distancing and you think about the idea of not having cohorts mixing, our learning centers are in many ways the most strict interpretation we can use following the social distancing. We staffed those so that there were only 8 students in any given room, and we also staffed them so that the adults in the room didn't have to go and check in on other rooms. So you didn't have adults being the vector that crossed different groups and then could possibly transmit. So we staffed our learning centers with 8 students to 2 adults, and that has required a great deal of staff. And so our challenge in delivering on that has been, we have pulled staff. We have paraeducators, instructional helpers, bus drivers, food nutrition workers, some other employees from different roles, and we've also hired a number of new people who are new to HCPS to work in these centers. And we've hired between 30 and 50, we have people coming in that we're still hiring to staff those. What's happened since we opened is, first, we've gone through a lot to identify people to work in those learning centers. And that has been a challenge logistically, but again, because we have people with lots of other work that they're also assigned to do. But right now, because we're not in person, those activities aren't being called on. But as we begin transitioning to having them in person, we're going to need those people back in the work. We've learned a lot with the learning centers. And if you look across the state and you look at the numbers of students who are back in person in schools, and again, I'll acknowledge that that isn't in-person learning, but just the experience during COVID, this completely unprecedented time, just the experience of having students come into schools have been a tremendous source of institutional learning. It has been a challenge for our schools to work through the logistics, but those pale in comparison to the logistics we'd have if we were bringing thousands of more students in. We've had between 1 and 2,000 students in our schools since last Tuesday. So let me give you an example of some of the things that we've confronted just with this. And this again, while the instruction is still virtual, on Tuesday, we had 21 people who, following the state protocol, and this is guidance that we are all required, all school systems in the state are required to follow this protocol. The first day, we had 21 people who we have to either isolate or quarantine. That means if a student or a staff member walked in exhibiting symptoms, they were coughing, for example, that's the big one we run into. So if they're exhibiting symptoms, we then have to assess that student. We also have to determine who they've come in close contact with. And on the first day of school, we had to send home 21 people. A mixture of staff and students were caught up in that. For the next 2 days, it was like 23 and 25 the next day. And then on Friday, we had 46 people we had to send home. And then today we had 49 people we had to send home. And this is with a very small percentage of our students in our schools. We are learning to work through those processes. And those are safety protocols required by the state for any time when you have an infection or a suspected infection. Now, fortunately, if the isolated person, the one who had the symptoms, goes, gets a test, comes back negative, the group that they were caught up with, the group that they were in close contact with, everyone can come back after we know that that's negative. And thus far, we've been fortunate that some of the groups have been able to come back even after being out for a day or two. But the logistics of addressing who's going out, who's coming in, keeping track of that, these are all things that we're learning along with every other school system. And again, if we had opened with, pick a percentage, 25% of our kids, 9,000, between 9 and 10,000 students, and you multiplied the number of students the number of people that were caught up in these types of incidents, it would have been completely unmanageable. Point being, I absolutely understand that everybody wants to see the children back in school and learning. I absolutely agree. I do want to see our children back in school and learning. We have protocols that we are expected to follow by the state, coming out of the same offices that are telling us we need better plans for reopening. But at the same time, because we've brought these students in, Harford County Public Schools is in a better place than many districts because we've been learning how to work through these things. We understand the impact of bringing students into school during COVID. And, unless the state changes the guidance about 6 feet, unless the state changes the guidance about cohorts, we are going to have limits for how many people we can bring back at one time. The choice right now for school systems in Maryland is not to bring all students in. That's not on the table, and none of us would be able to do that. That being said, here in the district, we are working very deliberately on how to bring our students in soon. Tonight's presentation and what you're going to see in the upcoming slides, this is part 1 of 2 presentations. Next Monday evening, fortunate that we have a board meeting coming so quickly. There are more details. I have more people we have to work through with some of this because I do not want to sit here and say we're bringing this group back at this time and then have to change that. Now, the possibility is our data in the county, our transmission rates could change anywhere along the way and cause things to have to change direction. But I will bring back to you next week a more detailed list of which groups we seek to bring back, in what order, and essentially how many students we expect that to be. Tonight, we're going to talk more just about the decision-making process and the larger framework. So for some of this, we'll be on hold, but I'm going to move now to the remainder of the slides. So the plan overview, as we have it, it will describe the decision-making strategy we'll employ for returning groups of students to in-person activities. And if you're following along on the live stream, I know you don't have the visual, the PDF that is posted as the material, I'm on slide 2 right now, the plan overview slide. As we bring students into school for in-person activities, we will monitor the impact of those activities have on transmission of COVID-19. So, of course, we've already begun to see that. We've seen how many students we've had to isolate, or students and staff we've had to isolate and quarantine already, and we'll be watching to see not only if that continues to increase, because right now what we've seen is the numbers of those have been increasing, but we'll also see if that begins to affect broader community transmission of the virus. If the transmission rates stay level or continue to improve, we will be able to return greater number of students and staff to schools. And as I said, next week we'll talk more about the schedule for that. However, and this is the caveat in every one of these conversations, if transmission rates increase, we may need to reduce in-person activities. And I'll talk a little more about the specifics on that in a moment. Slide 3, a couple additional considerations. We are incorporating the common metrics widely used to track community transmission of COVID-19, and this actually speaks very deliberately to the metrics that we were provided in the guidance that came from the state on August 27th. The metrics determine the degree to which, so I should say the metrics and the safety perimeters. So when I think of the metrics, it's the numbers, it's what percentage of people are affected. And then the safety perimeters are things like 6 feet, the social distancing, the cohorts. When you combine the metrics with those safety parameters, that's when we can start thinking about the design of the educational structures and how many people we have. And that's the convergence of those variables. And we will continue working with the Harford County Health Department about these metrics, safety parameters, and corresponding educational structures. One thing that's been very clear is, it's not the school system's role, it's not the educator's role to identify either the metrics, in other words, which measures to use, nor the rates within those measures. So, we do rely on the guidance, and the current guidance document we have from the state, again, co-produced by the State Department of Ed, the Governor's Office, and the State Health Department, and then also working closely with our health department here in town. We have a standing group right now that involves health department members, staff from the administration, as well as, this is my time for a quick shout out to 2 board members, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Bauer, who have been tremendous contributors to this conversation. That we look at the intersection of the health metrics, the safety parameters, and the educational structures. So the health metrics, positivity. We've all heard a lot about positivity. We heard something in comments tonight about where we look to our positivity, because there's the positivity in the dashboard that I'm showing right now comes from the Maryland. This is the one managed by the Maryland Health Department. I know that there's differences with how Johns Hopkins, for example, measures positivity, but it's the Maryland Department of Health that's giving us the metrics to follow, and so we're using their metrics at this point. But that's, again, to have a broader understanding of how people look at this. We need to look at different places, but the resource for us when we talk about our decision making will be to look at the positivity based on the State Department of Health guidance. And what you see on the slide here, the solid light blue line is the statewide positivity rates. You see the thinner line with purple triangles is the Harford County rate. This measures the rates day by day. I pulled this on Saturday, and the latest data it had on there at that point was September 10th, so it had Thursday's data. And what you see is, yes, for all of March until July 25th was the first time Harford County actually exceeded the state average in positivity. And currently, for the last week or so, Harford County has been slightly above the state average for positivity, but we remain below the 5% mark, and that 5% mark is essential. If you look at the other major metric, this is the second one that we received guidance from the state to use. It was that we need to look at the average case rate per 100,000 in the jurisdiction. And so the new case rate for Harford, again, right now you've seen it go up. You saw, through the spring and early into the summer. In fact, we didn't sort of get close to the state rate until late in August. So now we're kind of sitting right neck and neck with the state at around 10 cases per 100,000. So that is the second major metric we're using. And then again, this chart shows a daily rate. If you go to the governor's website, the governor has a place where it talks about the 7-day average, but what's on that site is actually a weekly average, and we think that's a better measure for us to use because it goes up and down a little bit every day. But then the numbers are fairly similar. The 7-day average, and again, I pulled this data on Saturday, the 12th. The 7-day average at that point was 4.37 positivity for Harford County and 9.17 case rate. That's about where we are right now. I think our daily case rate was a little bit closer to 10 the last couple of days. But anyway, we're hanging in that range, below 5% positivity and under 10 cases per 100,000. This isn't the very best picture, but it does help you get the idea. I have a photograph here on slide 7 that shows 8 desks. The desks with the chairs on them, which is where the students would sit, this is at Abingdon Elementary School. Those desks are 6 feet from each other. This room could possibly, I think if we stretched it, we could probably put 4 more desks in here. So we could take this room from 8 to 12 students. But if we are going to produce a plan that has our average classrooms, and this is a pretty average size classroom, our average classrooms can probably support, if we're following the 6-foot distancing guideline, can probably support between 8 and 12 desks across the district. And so the guidance from August 27th from the state says we should be following, wherever practical, the 6-foot distancing. What it doesn't have, and this was something that we were struggling with all throughout the summer, so the fact that this got adjusted, is there is not a group size requirement. In fact, it very specifically, the guidance very specifically speaks to the fact that there's no discussion of group sizes. As long as we can do the 6-foot distancing, that should define the group size. So as many desks as we can fit in, 6 feet apart, is what determines how many students we can have in a specific classroom. So that means any model that we look to, we should be targeting approximately 10 students per classroom coming in at a maximum as a regular thing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we get to that here in a minute. Slide 8, we see sort of 3 broad phases. You could say that these sort of match the stages, but again, because the school systems haven't received guidance, stage 1 for the schools has not been the same as stage 1 for the rest of the Maryland economy. And I mean, businesses opening doesn't necessarily mean the same for schools. And so we haven't had a clear alignment with the stages across the state, but so how we've looked at this, and I'm going to go deeper into this in a moment, that the first category is high transmission time. And back in the spring, we saw our transmission rates. We saw our positivity rates well over 5, in fact, over 10 at some point. We saw those high transmission times. And really, if we're in the high transmission phase or we return to it during this year, we would be looking at completely online, everything closed down, more the way we were in the spring. And that would mean even like our learning centers would close if we had transmission rates that leapt into those areas. Currently, we are in what we kind of define as the moderate transmission phase, which has our metrics within a certain range. What's in the guidance is that we need to be below a 5% positivity rate and that we need to be between 5 and 15 new cases per 100,000. And then if we reach a phase that we consider low transmission, we can expect that that's something under 5 cases per 100,000, but as of right now, we don't have any metrics to use for what low transmission would be that might allow us to change some of our structures. So right now, in the plan for Harford County, we're here in the first step of the moderate transmission. As I said, when we started with learning centers, we started with a very conservative approach that gave us great control over our group size and the mixing of the cohorts, and that's what our learning centers have done. The guidance for those learning centers, and this goes back to our conversations with the Harford County Health Department, were that we start with a strict interpretation of the physical distancing requirements. We monitor what happens with that for a period of time. The suggestion was 4 weeks. And we see, again, if that's having a major impact on our local transmissions within the sites, but also if we're beginning to see any kind of impact in the broader transmission rates in the county. And so if we're seeing that the return to these in-person activities are increasing transmission in the broader population. So quick review, high transmission. So here's how we want to look at this. You're going to see 3 variables here. I'm on slide 9 or page 9 of the handout. The metrics, again, the 2 major metrics we're using, positivity, that when we're considered in a high transmission period, that our positivity is greater than 5%, and that the new case rate is greater than 15 per 100,000. Again, we are not in that phase now, but should we return to that place? And again, that's a guide. We have to, be looking at other things along with this, but should we see both of those metrics go above those numbers, that's the conversation that ensues and with the health department about should we consider going into more restrictive circumstances, which could mean closing completely again. So the safety conditions in this high transmission phase is no in-person activities. So that means everything, including learning centers, would be closed. And all activities performed virtually. So we're fortunate, we're not there. We've gotten down to this area where we are in what we call a moderate transmission. And so this means we have the flexibility to be in person with the social distancing requirement. So I've described this briefly in some of my comments, that the positivity needs to be below 5%, which it currently is. We're approaching it, which is concerning, but we are between 4 and 5% right now. Our new cases need to be between 5 and 15 per 100,000. And again, we're right around 10. And then, as I indicated, we also need to be looking at how often we're requiring people to quarantine at our sites, as well as the trajectory of all the metrics. If we were going for a few weeks and we'd stayed below 5, but we were lingering around 4.8 or 4.9 on the positivity, that might suggest we should delay, moving into more in person until we see the trajectory start to point the right direction. And so again, those are conversations, decisions we'll make in conjunction with our health department. The safety conditions, as we've described, 6 feet for social distancing. Cohort mixing is very minimal. Like I said, we set the learning centers up so that our groups did not have to mix much. The mask requirement is, again, that is one of the things we have clarity from the state on. We have an order that we are to require masks in all circumstances except when students are eating, or if students have a specific physical need to not have them on. Again, that speaks more to students with certain disabilities and those sorts of things. Hand washing protocols, again, are things that we've worked through. We have as expectations in our schools, and of course, very clear cleaning protocols. So this is slide 11. What I'm giving you this evening is a much more general description of what we're doing. What we hope to be able to bring you next week is a much clearer list that lays out groups more specifically. So I'm going to sort of do the step A is where we are now. That's our current state, learning support centers as we have them. You've seen them in operation, 8:2 student to staff ratio, and then virtual learning for all of our students. Our next step which we hope to be able to do within 4 weeks, is the first is bringing back some of our neediest small groups of students, some of those populations of students that lend themselves to being in small groups. Most notably, we'll be looking at our special education students and some others, or some of our special education, particularly special education, sort of more high intensity programs. And then we want to look at a limited hybrid to start our groups with very small groups. And then we believe we'll be starting here with our lowest grade levels and begin thinking about working up. Step C, if we are able to, again, bring back more of our students, the Step B students will introduce, a much larger number of students to our schools. We get those in place. We have some time to monitor whether having those students in place does anything to dramatically change our transmission rates. If we're not seeing a huge spike in students coming to school sick, which requires people being isolated or sent home and those sorts of things, the degree to which people are doing a good job keeping children home if they're not healthy, that will minimize the impact we have on all groups, because that could turn very disruptive. Like I said, we had 49 students and adults that were excluded today because of a small number of people who exhibited symptoms. And but if we have many times the number of students in schools, when those cases are multiplying, that's a lot of disruption, and we'll have a lot to worry about in terms of who we have to staff the buildings if we have to send too many groups home. So that is something we have to be very conscious of. So by the time we get to Step 3, the goal here, and I can state the goal by the end of Step C right now, is that if we're able to get through all 3 of these steps this fall, that will have all of our students back into school for some in-person learning. So at least, and I'll say at least 1 day a week, in some cases more, for all students before the end of this calendar year. But there's a lot of reliance on our metrics continuing to stay where they are or continue moving in a good direction. So I'm going to just quickly go over low transmission, because I think this is where many of us would like to be moving to, and I would argue that this stage, again, we don't have clear guidance on, but even this I don't think is the true return to the type of school we were in pre-COVID. There is no metric yet set for positivity. So we know that the moderate transmission is below 5%, but we don't know if we go below 2% or we go below 1%, if we will have some different safety parameters. The new case rate, we can guess that because we've been given a range of 5 to 15 is the target case rate we're looking at now. We can guess that if the case rate drops below 5, that we may be able to move into a less restrictive phase. But as of right now, the only way we can change the number of students we're bringing back, because the model that we are proposing, and the model we're proposing in Step C, I believe would put us at the limits of what we could reasonably bring back within the social distancing guidance we have. So before we can move to something with unrestricted group size, in other words, anyone who wants to return, that we open the classes to as many people who want to return as possible, knowing that some may want to remain virtual. But we can't go to an unrestricted group size if we still have the guidance from the state that we need to maintain the 6 feet of social distancing. If cohort intermingling is not something we have to be concerned with. So in order for us to go to all students in place, we need the guidance from the state around the social distancing to be changed at that level, and it needs to correspond to metrics. So right now we don't have metrics or rates that would tell us it's appropriate to have full groups. And that's something that we hope we'll hear or get some guidance on soon from them. And so the hope here that during this time we would return to in-person learning at all grade levels for, again, with unrestricted group sizes. And haven't said this so far in this presentation, but at each of these, regardless of what we go to this year, while we're still under the emergency order from the governor about COVID, we will leave virtual learning options available to families. We heard a lot about that tonight in the public comments that, we know there are many families who are not prepared to return their children to schools yet, and they want to remain virtual. We will keep that available to people, at least as long as we're under the emergency order, and that's something we can have a conversation on going forward. And it may be that there will be other group size restrictions that stay in place. We may not be able to do large field trips or assemblies or, have, thousands of students in stadiums. Those are things that, while we're still in COVID, even if we get to a lower transmission phase, that we'll probably have guidance about those large groups. But right now, again, we have no specific guidance about what we might be able to do in a lower transmission stage than we are now. So that's something we'll be waiting on. So 2 last slides on 13 now. The idea of moving between stages or progressing. Again, next week, I hope to be able to offer sort of our best case scenario schedule and how quickly we would move through the stages. But the things we'll be considering, again, this is a bit redundant, the weekly average positivity rate and a weekly average new case rate. We've talked a lot about that, but those are still the major drivers of any decision to move forward. And if those rates remain steady or they get better, if they decrease for 4 weeks, we'll move into the next less restrictive step. So again, the schedule that we're looking at, it's about a 4-week window before we would be bringing our first groups of students back. But I need to have the caveat here that any thoughts about moving forward, we still have some things that availability of PPE has been a major challenge for both healthcare providers and also for schools now. We have enough to run the programs we have in place right now, but the supplies for those are, I guess, not as reliable as we would hope. And so, some of the programs, particularly the students with greater needs and some of our special education programs, we need much more PPE to run those safely. And again, we have what we need right now for the students we have in place, but that is something that could affect decision making. And so we'll have to be monitoring that. Again, moving between stages, regressing. We hope to not reach this point, but I think there's a lot of belief out there that particularly as we start looking at symptoms compounded or confounded by the onset of flu season, or if there is just a large resurgence in COVID, that we might need to move backwards. Again, same 2 metrics, positivity and new case rate. The guidance document from the state, the one I've referenced a few times, speaks to needing to reassess moving to more restrictive steps if the case rate increases by 2 per 100,000, or if the positivity rate increases by 1.5%. And the guidance in the state document says over the course of 2 weeks. Again, I think these are just a thing for us to look at. If we see our rates moving in the wrong direction and they reach the scale of 2 per 100,000, or if we go up by more than 100%, that's where the conversations, we might press pause on the next steps of bringing students in. But also these are clearly conversations we'll be having with the health department. And that's what I'm saying right here. We'll collaborate, the final bullet is we'll collaborate with the health department if we experience increased transmission rates. So as I said, next week, we will have more about grade levels and groups and time for students coming back. We also, I think people understand that as we start bringing groups back, we'll very quickly need to be bringing staff back, and that will require a lot of sort of working through processes related to that. So those are announcements that we'll be rolling out with you next week. So with that said, that ends the presentation. Board, I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bulson. We will start with Dr. Bauer.
Thank you. Could you speak just briefly about what you see other school systems in Maryland doing?
There's a mixture, but right now, I know I saw an article today. We know Talbot County, which is a district of, I think it's under 5,000 students. They begin their hybrid model next week, and they're starting with a couple hundred students coming into their schools for that. Most of the districts are looking at small groups. I've heard superintendents talking about trying to get to a place where they're having 50% in within the next, hopefully going into the next quarter. I think our plan kind of puts us in a similar place as what I've heard some of the districts talking about. Again, districts had different ways of bringing in groups. I know our partners to the east in Cecil County, they brought back about 5% of their students for in-person learning, and I commend them on that work. And so there are very few districts with many students in schools right now, but they all have plans like this to start looking at the different groups they can bring in.
Thank you. No other questions at the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell.
Thank you. Dr. Bulson, thank you for this very thorough report. I appreciate it. It has answered several of my questions and the questions that I've heard parents and families asking in the community. Thank you for speaking to the purpose and the intention and the data that we are using in terms of the learning support centers. I think it's important for us as a community at large to hear, right, some of the the results of having in-person interactions within the schools. So I think that was very, very helpful. Thank you for stating and restating the metrics in terms of positivity rate and new case rate. So I appreciate this. You answered many questions for me, and I'm sure many others. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Karwacki.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Bulson, thank you. You answered many of my questions as well. I see this as one major component of the larger reentry plan, and I'm really pleased that we're coming back next week to fill in many of the details. I do have 2 questions. Do we know at this point how many teachers are willing to come back to the classroom in person and by school and by grade level? And along with that, how many students would we anticipate, or do we know how many are willing to come back to each school and by grade level to be sure that we have a good match between students and available faculty?
One of the major lessons learned from staffing the learning centers, because when we put the survey out to staff, we put it out to parents asking if they were interested in enrolling in that, and then we put the survey out to staff about who would be willing to come in. One of the unfortunate realities of that is we had less than a third of what we needed even to staff the relatively small number of students who requested seats in the learning centers, and the staffing of that has been one of the challenges. I don't believe, well, I won't even say I don't believe, I know for a fact we won't be able to deliver on a plan based solely on volunteers. We are going to need people to return to work. What we've been working on with our with our HR department and to some degree with, looking at our other stakeholders. We have been talking with our association. As you know, we have a memorandum of understanding with HCEA that we have a variety of different benefits people can apply for. One of them that's in the memorandum of understanding is some flexibility around applying for leave of absence if someone doesn't qualify for any other benefits. So the short answer to your question is we don't know the specific number. I don't believe that. I think again, if the guidance from the original survey is of help, that it's going to be really difficult to get that type of information in advance. So unfortunately, we're going to be in a place where we have to require people to come back based on their jobs, because the expectation is as we ramp this plan up through the fall, our goal is to continue to create a safe environment by very carefully controlling the number of students who are in place, keeping those group sizes small, attending to the social distancing requirements we have. But we will essentially be looking at requiring all staff to return in person at first.
Thank you so much for that response. I do want to take just a moment to say thank you to Dr. Bauer and Dr. Phillips and our health department and our internal staff who deal with student health on a daily basis for being a part of this process. And thank you for the background information you provided tonight. It should certainly be helpful to those people in the community that have concerns about us and how we are moving forward. Thank you again.
If I could, I realize I didn't answer the second half of your question,
Okay.
which is how many students. So again, surveys of any kind, our response rates have been going down. So the way we're designing the plan is, again, being as cautious and with smaller groups. As we're considering who we bring back, we're looking at bringing first small numbers and then incrementally growing the group size. But once we started inviting people back, we will then be in a better place to get clarity on who's coming and who isn't. So again, if we find that if we invite students back in groups of 10, but only half of them come, and we find that 50% of a group isn't planning to return in person, we can adjust and bring students back for more days because we won't have to split them in such small groups, if that makes sense.
Yes,
So our ability to move into more time in person will be affected by the number of students who are planning to come back. And so that's part of the calculation, because understandably, no matter how well we frame the questions, I think everyone is kind of waiting and watching and seeing what exactly will happen. And it's been really hard for people to even know how to answer the question, am I ready to come back now? Because so many things contribute to that decision. And I know a lot of people, they're just plain ready, but I also know that there's a lot of people who are on the fence and those who are going to be inclined to be really cautious. And so when we know how many are coming back in one type of model, then we can know how easy it will be for us to scale up and bring students in for more time.
absolutely. And I'm really pleased to have heard that our priority initially is going to be some of the students that have special needs, and also our youngest, newest learners that are entering the school system. Our K-3 students really, really have to be a priority in this, and thank you for mentioning that. I have no further questions or comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mueller.
Well, you pretty much just answered what I was going to ask. I am concerned about the special education and the K-3, especially since they don't have the devices. At least not all of them were given the devices and such. I'm very concerned about their ability to be able to do the online learning. And I understand now that the pace that we can bring them back is being controlled by the state, because we get a lot of comments from the public, like, well, Pennsylvania has a school district that's back. Why isn't our school district back? So I think that you've answered those concerns, that we're bound by the state regulations. So I have no additional questions at this time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Phillips.
Just very briefly, Dr. Bulson, a very nice presentation of things that a lot of people have been working very hard on. And I just hope that the community recognizes that we're going through this in a very systematic fashion. We want to make sure that the safety of everybody is kept in mind, but we also understand that students need to be back at school. And hopefully, I think the community will realize that despite what Governor Hogan said on TV a few weeks ago, we've been working on this way before that announcement was made. Harford County has been working hard to get kids back to school. And I think this shows the efforts that have been put in by many at the central office, the health department, and we all look forward to moving forward as you've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Ms. Riccardi.
Thank you, Dr. Bulson. Appreciate the time you put into this. I agree with Ms. Koraki and what she said about the early learners and our special needs children, and I'm just anxious next week to see the dates and how the rollout continues or is initiated to get our kids back in school. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Rush.
Yeah, I mean, Ms. Riccardi just said it very well. I'll look forward to next week and go for the deep dive then. Thank you very much.
Ms. Bailey.
I just want to echo everything you said. Basically, I mean, I'm getting a lot of different opinions on whether or not we should be going back into school. And I know personally, I'm eager to get back into school. But are being carefully thought out. There there's pressure, but there's not pressure at the same time. Paying close attention to it, if that makes sense. And thank you again for the time and effort that you put into the presentation for tonight. And that's all for me.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey.
Ms. Gaudier.
Yes, sir. I just want to make sure that we stress to everyone that this is a hybrid model. We are still talking about if people are feeling unsafe, if they have immunocompromised children in their home or if they are themselves, that we will still be offering some sort of virtual option, correct?
That is correct. So the virtual will remain available. We know that everybody's responding to this differently, and there's different levels of fear and concern, and so that, like I said, we'll commit to that. I know we can remain committed to that at least as long as we're under the emergency order from the governor. And if we come out from under that, that's something we'll have to look at carefully, because MSDE still hasn't changed some of the rules around virtual learning for school systems. So that's something we'll have to assess then. But our intent is to provide a virtual learning option for everyone, probably throughout this year.
Great. And then the other thing I also want to address, which I realize wasn't a part of it, but it is something that we keep hearing a lot of concerns about. And I think that we probably do. We have more answers. I know we have more answers. Is that parents seem to be very concerned, understandably so, about sports. I don't feel like we've talked about it very much, because that came down from, I'm going to get it wrong, MSPSSA. And this does not have anything to do with that. We are not talking about sports. We are talking about school and returning to learn. Correct?
Correct. I think you described that well. we are not having that conversation about sports. The NPSSAA talked about a different model for doing sports seasons beginning in the spring, and there's been some discussion about what's appropriate for school systems to do, whether it's some sort of whether you're allowed to do sort of small group training, but it's not like real practice. I mean, there's some specificity around what can happen, but it's very, very limited. So our conversation in this presentation is not really touching on that, but I know the NPSSAA has their plan is now out and available for people to view. But that's mostly starting everything up in the spring.
Okay, and the only other question that I have regarding all of this is, are we, and again, I don't even know if it's the appropriate thing, are we looking at things like, since we're talking about returning to learning, since we're talking about, elementaries first, and let's get in our kids with some higher needs that need more intensive assistance. Are we talking at all about getting our secondary kids some things like PSAT testing and AP testing? I mean, I realize it's kind of not all linked, but in parents' minds, it really is.
Sorry, I was muted. I try to go through a whole night without doing that.
That's okay.
So we do have, we ran into some interesting roadblocks with SAT because the College Board has been a little difficult to work with there, but we do have a model now where we're offering the SAT to Harford County students only. It's a fairly limited number. We're trying to create a few more seats for some of our juniors. We offered it first to seniors. So we do have some details around that. AP testing is different. That's only scheduled in the spring. That AP only offers that once a year. And so right now they're not really putting answers out there about the spring. I know less about where we are with ACT right now, but those are certainly things. I don't know if there's more that Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Carr could offer on this, but they've been working on that. They give me updates. I've been getting updates about SAT because a lot of superintendents are asking about that. Mm-hmm. So these are things that we're also discussing. But for those spring-oriented tests, I think those groups, because International Baccalaureate is also, again, they're offered just in the spring. So right. I think they're kind of hanging on to see what we're dealing with then. But I don't know, Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Carr, if either of you would like to jump in.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Hi, this is Mike O'Brien. We do have 2 SAT dates on the books. We do have a capacity of 80 students, so we've allowed seniors to register first. They have until the week before, and then we're opening any seats to juniors, and that's at every one of our schools, including our alternative school. We are looking at avenues for the ACT offering this fall. We've been working with them, and actually our alternative school is helping to take the lead on the ACT. We're also looking at the ASVAB and working with College Board as we look to the AP testing and IB testing coming into the spring. So our hope is to continue with just like we would in any year with the test offerings for kids.
Great. Mr. O'Brien, can you tell me if that includes the PSAT? I know that there are National Merit Scholar ramifications, and that the fall testing is pretty key to that, maybe even early winter testing. But I just want to make sure that we're looking at something like that locally so that our kids who might qualify get the opportunity.
Good question. I mean, at this point, our focus has been the SAT and our seniors. So we haven't scheduled a PSAT date this fall, but it's something that we're still looking into, possibly going into the winter. It was really important for us to get those SAT dates on the books. We've not forgotten about the PSAT, but we have taken that as this kind of the backseat to the SAT, but we recognize it's still important as well.
Great, thank you. Like I said, I know this doesn't seem like it has a lot to do with reopening and what all that means, but parents hear reopening and they automatically start thinking, hey, we're going to start moving forward and doing all of these things that we had planned on initially. So we need to make sure we're looking out for that information, because I know I'm going to have to. That's it. That's all the questions I have. Thank you all very much, the people that have been working on it, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Bauer. I appreciate you representing the board and helping out too.
Thank you.